So let us look here in our second lecture about the social crisis. First, we'll try to see the new world of these factories. As we know, the industrial city is a kind of reader for many believers. They do not understand its workings, they fear its sins and crimes. Throughout its history, however, Christianity has been both conservative and radical force. And it proved so in this industrial crisis. So France, had a political revolutions, Germany and intellectual revolutions, but England gave birth to these industrial revolutions. As the leading commercial and this financial power, England had the markets as the money for industrial productions. Late in this 18th century, industrial had some breakthrough to greater productivity, but none was more important than the harnessing of steam. For example, James Watt from 1736 to 1819, the Scottish genius, at the University of this Glasgow, found a way to control the supply of steam and drive a pistons back and forth in a closed cylinder. Soon steam engines were employed in the manufacturing textiles and later in driving locomotive and ships. For the first time, a manufacturer had a source of power that did not depend upon the climates or the seasons for driving windmills or water wheels. The factory becomes the symbol of a new industrial order. Here the power and the machinery made productivity possible. So people to run the machines were forced to leave their cottage looms and fields to join the workforce in some factory. Life was suddenly changed. Gone for many was rural or small town life with a pack of work that was determined by night and day, sowing the harvest. In its place people found the precisions and the regiments of the factory wall. God's sun was hid behind the smoke, and its place was the factory whistle, symbol of man's times, not God. So the industrial revolutions greatly increased the wealth of mankind, but it brought a host of evils for the workers massed together in the ever expanding factories of these European and the American cities. The early factories were without the most elementary sanitary and safety facilities. Horrible cases of mingling were common, and under English common law any accidents a worker might suffer was considered a result of his own negligence. So the employers could not be held responsible. There was no system of workmen compensations or health insurance, and injured workers was likely to be thrown out in the street as destitutes, and his job given to one of the thousands who had flocked to the new cities in search of these employments. So we find here that women and children work alongside of men. Poverty often forced women to toil until a day or two before delivery of their children, and then to report back to work shortly after the baby was born. So many mills employed youngsters only 4 or 5 years of age, and the work days were slave, meaning 12 to, the time was 12 to 15 hours of hard labors for minimum wages. So the workers and their families lived in a single room in dirty tenements and were fortunate if they did not have to share it with other families. So the streets around them were filled with garbage without adequate sewers, drainage. You know, they find this kind of horrible conditions of life during this 18th century of the industrial revolutions. So the all class conflicts between these aristocrats and the middle class that had raged in the Western Europe during these early years of this 19th century had ended in the triumph of this bourgeoisie, meaning the middle class, the farmers. With their victory had come an economic philosophy called laissez-faire. The theory held that the social ills of this industrialism defied corrections. Every individual should be left alone to pursue his own interests. Then everything was supposed to work out for the happiness of the greatest number. The textbook of the Social of Thoughts, written by Adam Smith, Well of Nations, argued that social benefited most from these competitions. The more efficient individuals gained the greater rewards, although governments were responsible for this protection of life and the property. The hands of this government should be kept out of the business. The time, meaning the best interests of this society, are served by free operations of laws of supply and demand. So the urban working force, however, had no access to these benefits of these competitions. They were without property and therefore without the vote to change conditions. The struggle in this 19th century was for access to these, you know, other means of power. So the early attacks upon this capitalist laissez-faire philosophy came from a new concept called socialism. At this early stage, the term did not stand for a military workers' movement. It was mostly a theory that condemned the concentrations of wealth and called for this public or worker ownership of business. Above all, the socialists insisted that harmony and the cooperations, not ruthless competition, should control economic affairs. These early socialists were utopians because their theories of model communities were based upon the notions that men naturally love one another, that they could live happily together. So it was capitalist competition, they said, that set man against man. Thus, the many problems of this industrial society tended to the concentrates on one question, that is property. Is there any man and natural and inalienable right to own things? The church had always said there was, it seems, to be embodied in these 10 commandments. Thou shalt not covet. Thou shalt not covet neighbor house or his ox, nor anything that is in thy neighbor. So those who had rejected the principle had been treated as heretics. But never before this 19th century had there been so much property to be owned or so much allowed to own it. Millions instead of thousands were dispossessed and wholly dispossessed. So the Roman people had of all been appeased with bread and circuses, but in this later age both had vanished. The poor were allowed neither corn nor carnival. Hunger preoccupies the lowest classes, and insecurity creeps more and more among the middle classes. So the churches were not in a strong position to speak to the crisis. The trend is modern times to separate the church, and the church had left the churches without a political platform. So the constitutions of the United States forbids the federal government to make any church the religious of the land. So the English reforms of 1830s strips the Church of England of many traditional privileges, and in countries where Roman Catholics were numerous, especially France and Italy, anti-clerical feelings limited church authorities. In short, the churches had been excluded from the arena where crucial decisions were made. Men inside and outside the church came to think of this Christianity in narrower and narrower terms. Almost everything not obviously spiritual was left free from the criticisms. Thus, a growing body of these industrial workers regarded the churches and the Christian message as largely irrelevant or powerless to speak to the difficulties they suffer in the age of this machine. Then we found most interesting is about the Karl Marx arose, preaching a new forms of socialism. Karl Marx criticized Christianity, claiming it was untrue to its own vision. It had taken the side of these wealthy oppressors. Like religious generally, Christianity was a tool in the hands of the rich to oppress the poor. So Christians preaching exhorted the poor to suffer injustice in the here and now, promising a reward in heaven. So Christianity also misguided people by lofty and distracting conversations about noble ideas. So Karl Marx argued instead that the current circumstances were the results of these conflicts between the social classes. He thought that the time had come for the poor to rise up to engage in history-changing violence. So, you know, like for example, born in this Raylan attire of these German Jewish parents who had been converted to Christianity. So Marx from 1818 to 1883 obtained his doctoral degree after studying the ideas of philosopher by George Hegel. So in the year of this January 1848, Marx and Hegel published the famous Communist Manifesto. These daring documents contain practically all the elements of what they call scientific socialisms. It opens with an ominous declarations, a spectra in hunting Europe, the spectra of these communists. The manifesto called for an implacable struggle against this bourgeoisie, meaning the farmers, the middle class. It proclaims the inevitable revolutions and the triumph of these masses and the close with the stern warning. It's quoted here. The communists disdains to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that all their ends, meaning all their ends, can be attained only by the forceful overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at the communistic revolutions. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chain. They have a war to win. Working men of all countries unites. After a short time in Germany, Marx spends the rest of his life in London, most of it on the edge of the survival, supported largely by the contributions from friends, especially from Eagles. Mark also, daily made his way to the British Museum where he collected material for his various books, especially Das Kapital, meaning capital. Whatever one may think of this Marxist socialism, no one can doubt that Das Kapital from 1867 to 94 constitutes one of the most influential books of these modern times. For a season in this 20th century, nearly half of the world was organized under this government rooted in the Marxisms. As in the slavery controversy, Christian movements fell on all sides of the social crisis. Many church members were capitalists. They owned factories and had several influential positions in societies. Many were eager to defend the laissez-faire philosophy. After the middle of this 19th century, however, an increasing middle of these Christians, Catholic and Protestants worked jealously for improved conditions for laborers. Four lines of actions were opened to them. First, they could challenge the laissez-faire philosophy in the name of Christian principles. Number two is that they could establish Christian institutions to relieve the suffering of the poor and powerless. Point number three is that they could support the formations of labor union. The fourth point is that they could appeal to the state for these legislations aimed at the improvements of working conditions. So we find here in this Roman Catholic circle, as early 1848, German bishop like Wilhelm Kittler from 1811 to 77 addressed the problems of the factory worker in sermons and books. He sketched out a Catholic solutions that pointed out the danger in both the unlimited competitions of these capitalisms, the exaggerated state control of the socialists. He defeated the right of state intervention against the capitalists and the right of private property against the totalitarian tendency of the socialists. Above all, he insisted on the right of workers to form their own associations, and he called for a whole series of reform, including profit sharing, reasonable working hours, sufficient rest day, factory inspections, and the regulations of this female and child labor. So in England, the workers found a friend among the Roman Catholics in Henry Edward Cardinal Manning from 1892, a convert from this evangelical Anglicanisms. As early as December 1872, Manning appeared at a meeting held to promote the cause of farm workers. It was a courageous act since it was the first time in England that a Roman Catholic prelate had so openly taken the side of labor. He followed this up with a letter to the Prime Minister Gladstone, arguing two things: the pages of law prohibiting the labor of children under certain age, and the regulations of housing. In 1874, Manning delivered a lecture, Rights and Dignity of Labor, in which he forcefully defended the right of the worker to organize, called for law to regulate the hours of work, made a plea for people to look into these horrible abuses associated with child labor. So in the 19th century, however, officials of this Roman Catholic, including Pope, fear labor unions. They remember too well the conflicts with Italian Masons and these political forces to unite Italy. So the night of this labor were in danger of this Babel condemnations, and probably only avoided it when this Archbishop of Baltimore, who later became Cardinal Gibbons, came to their defense. So we see here until 1891, did the Pope speaks to the social crisis. The aging Leo XIII outlines what has become the basic Catholic positions of this relationship between capital and the labor, that is called In Cylindrical Rerum Novarum, after calling attention to the evil conditions resulting from these industrial revolutions, rejects socialisms, and takes strong stance for the Christian family as the most essential unity of society. Leo stresses, however, the capitalist obligations to deal justly with workers. He defends the rights of Catholic workers to organize and to bargain with dishonor, as well as their right to a living wages and reasonable leisure. Thus, monopoly capitalisms and industrial slavery came under papal criticisms, as well as what he called socialisms. We also see here that laboring men in England, in large Protestant England, support for this laboring men came primarily from the non-conforming denominations. Until the middle of the 19th century, labor unions were illegal, but the labor movements found strong support among non-conformists, especially the Primitive Methodists. Many of the leaders of this labor movement had their apprenticements as Methodists, lay preachers. They simply carried into these working men's associations the zeal, the organizing skills, and the preaching experience found in the Methodist chapels. So nonconformists were also leaders in this temperance crusade and in the foundings of orphanages. George Muller of this Plymouth Brethren, Charles Haddon Spurgeon, the leading Baptist preacher in London, and T.B. Stevenson, a Methodist, were all instrumental in creating Christian orphanage. Then we see here the onward Christian soldiers. The most outstanding example of this ministry to the disposed was the work of this pietistic evangelical like William Booth. He started his ministry with the Methodist New Connections, but soon withdrew to work with London poor. His street preaching in London is an in 1864 met with phenomenal success. Within 11 years, he had 32 stations promoting evangelism and social service among London destitutes. His workers, organized like a military unit, were soon called the Salvation Army. Evangelical Booth became, General Booth. By 1888, the general had established 1,000 British corps and had dispatched patrol to many other nations. His book In Darkest England and The Way Out appeared in 1890, graphically comparing the social darkness in England to Africa, Darkness Pictures by David Livingstone. So in the London, in the year he reported 2,157 people had been found dead, 2,297 had committed suicide, 30,000 were living in these prostitutions, 160,000 had been convicted of drunkenness, and more than 900,000 were classed as paupers. So Booth went on to describe the army innermost rescue efforts. The whole picture was one of these dire needs. So the Church of England was so wed to the past that it had great difficulty adjusting to the social crisis. New parishes in these mushroom industrial towns requires an act of parliament. This was time-consuming and costly. As a result, the new urban masses usually grew beyond the care of the Church of England. One movement in this Anglican Church proved to be the striking exceptions. The Christian Socialist group like F. D. Maurice, a theologian, and Charles Kingsley, a novelist, and John Malcolm Ludlow, a lawyer, were churchmen who felt that the gospel had something to say to these working people of England. During its brief of this activity from 1848 to 54, the Christian Socialist movement attacks the whole laissez-faire outlook, meaning competitions. So Morrick wrote to Kingsley, is put forth as the law of the universe. That is a lie. The time is come for us to declare that it is a lie by word and deed. So the true law of the universe, he claimed, is that man is made to live in community. Men realize their true nature when they cooperate with one another as children of God and brothers in Christ. So the leaders of this Christian socialisms adopted the socialism's label to be provocative. It means no more, they said, than the science of making men partners. They consider it a development of Christianity and believe that the Christian faith stood for society that would enable men to work with one another instead of against one another. The practical results of the Christian socialist movements were limited. Their cooperative workshops were poorly organized and unduly optimistic about the role of this laborer. Their greatest contribution was probably in the idea that carried across this Atlantic to the United States. In general, workers in this 19th century England slowly gained both political power and better working conditions. Step by step, egg by the egg of England whittled away at these old laissez-faire doctrines and improved life for her working citizens. No children under 10 could work. Women and children were limited to a 10-hour day. Safety inspections were introduced in factories and many others. So England had provided many benefits for laboring people before many in the United States recognized a social crisis existed. So finally we see here the social gospel in America. The major movements for social justice in the United States was called social gospel. Movements among liberal Protestant pastors and theological professors, they form no outstanding organizations, but choose to work together, establish denominations and political agencies. The crux of the social gospel was the belief that God's saving work included corporate structure as well as personal lives. If it is true that social good and evil are collective in nature, not simply the total of good and evil individuals, then Christians are obliged to work for the reconstructions of social order. It is part of their religious responsibility. So the prophets of the social gospel drew upon a range of sources. Revivalism itself, which under like D.L. Moody becomes, heavily individualistic, had originally had a vision for moral and the Christians America. Before the Civil War, revival and reforms went hand in hand. Like Charles Finney, for example, encouraged his converts to move from the personal regeneration experience to the social missions of these anti-slavery crusades. Social gospel leaders also read, however, the works of these European Christian socialists like J. F. D. Murray, Charles Kingsley, and others. Finally, there was the new theology called the Progressive Orthodoxy, and Hanover Seminary, and the pulpits of this New England provided a general patrons of belief for the early preachers of the social gospel. The father of this movement was Washington Gladden from 1836 to 1918, who published the first of his many books on the social gospel in 1876. Transplanted New Englander, he spends his most influential years at this First Congregational Church of Columbus at Ohio. In this Ohio capital, he encounters the labor struggle firsthand. In his congregations were both employers and employees. So during the time of this industrial strife, Gladden witnessed with alarm the widening of the bridge between these classes. In a number of evening addresses, he focused on the labor problems and expressed his convictions that the teaching of Jesus contained principle for the right ordering of society. We catch something of the reformer spirit in his widely sung hymn, O Master, let me walk with thee in lonely paths of service free. Tell me thy secret, help me bear the strains of toil, the freights of care. So Gladden was so socialist. He held, to private property and private enterprise. Yet he believed many industrial could be run corporately, and that railroads, mines, and public service industries of the cities should be operated by the government. In terms of this lasting influence, the outstanding prophet of social gospel was Walter Rechenbus, that is from 1861 to 1918, as a young German Baptist pastor in a tenement sections of this New York City called Hell Kitchens. He struggled with the Christians' response to urban problems. The book that made him nationally prominent came during his year as a professor of church history at Rochester Theological Seminary. His three majors were Christianity and the Social Crisis, written on 1907, and Christianity, the Social Order, written in 1912, and a Theology for the Social Gospel, written 1917. So avoiding the confronting doctrines of this human progress, Rechenbus anchored his appeal to social responsibility in the concepts of Kingdom of God. Throughout its history, the church had tried to improve man's life on, earth, even as it prepared him for the world to come. It was always possible to concentrate on the text life so much that Christians appear insensitive to the pain of this present. Certainly, the social crisis of this last century made that obvious. The various Christian movements for the social concern face the danger of reducing the gospel to social activisms. They've left us all important reminder, however, that Christians cannot show their own concerns for people, eternal destiny, unless they also demonstrate their concerns for people's earthly needs. So thank you so much for listening this week lectures, and I will be attaching for you in my brief summary some of the books for your suggestions to read, because I think this is important for us to see the history of this industrial revolutions, how the people have suffered, and what is also reflect today into our life. So I hope this some of the important books will really help you. So if possible, I will try to put in my summary notes. And I wish you all a wonderful and a very blessed day and a blessed week.